One night in 1982, Caroline found Phil on the bedroom floor. He had a pulse, but barely. Blue lips, shallow breathing. The ambulance was coming for the 7th time. Yes, she'd been counting. 7 times in 2 years. One of the paramedics recognized the address by now, offered a sad, knowing nod as they loaded Phil onto the stretcher. The shame, the anger, the fear, but worst of all, the relief, because at least tonight she knew where he was. At least tonight he wasn't with another woman. At least tonight the girls wouldn't walk into the bathroom and see their father with a needle in his arm. When had marriage become this? When had love transformed into a grim calculus of lesser evils? And most importantly, what would it take for her to finally leave? Phil survived that night. Another overdose reversed. Another close call survived. But something in Caroline died. This is the story of that moment and the impossible choice facing anyone who loves an addict. Stay and watch them destroy themselves, or leave and live with the guilt forever. But to understand that impossible choice, we need to go back to the beginning. Back to when Caroline Crowther was just a young woman who'd fallen for a charming rock star. Back to when she still believed love could heal anything. Before we continue, please subscribe to our channel. Hit that notification bell so you never miss the untold stories behind music's greatest tragedies. Caroline Crowther was 24 years old when she first saw Phil Lynott perform in 1977. She'd grown up in the comfortable world of British television. Her father, Leslie Crowther, was one of the BBC's most beloved personalities, a household name who brought family entertainment into living rooms across the nation. Caroline herself had worked in television, comfortable in front of cameras, elegant in a way that suggested good breeding and easy confidence. Phil Lynott was everything her world wasn't. Working-class Dublin roots showing through the rock star veneer. Charismatic in a way that couldn't be taught, only born. Dangerous in the way that sensible parents warn their daughters about. When Thin Lizzy took the stage that night, Caroline watched Phil command the room with nothing but his presence and that iconic bass guitar. The way he moved, the way his voice could be tender one moment and raw the next, the confidence that poured off him, she was captivated. After the show, mutual friends made introductions. Phil turned on the charm, and it was genuine. He could be warm, present, genuinely interested when he chose to be. He told her about growing up in Dublin, about the poetry he wrote before he discovered music, about his dreams of making Thin Lizzy the biggest band in the world. Caroline saw depth beneath the rock star swagger. She saw vulnerability. She saw a man who'd fought for everything he had and wasn't done fighting. Leslie Crowther had his reservations. What father wouldn't, watching his daughter fall for a touring rock musician? But Phil won him over with intelligence, ambition, and genuine affection for Caroline. When Phil talked about music, his passion was infectious. When he talked about Caroline, his voice carried something that sounded like love. What Caroline didn't see, or perhaps chose not to see, were the patterns already forming. The nights Phil disappeared without complete explanation. The mood swings that seemed extreme even for an artist's temperament. The way conversations with bandmates would stop abruptly when she entered the room. Small signs, easy to rationalize when you're falling in love with someone magnetic. In 1978, Caroline discovered she was pregnant. The news arrived like a storm, unexpected, overwhelming, forcing questions neither was quite ready to answer. They weren't married. Phil was touring constantly, living out of hotels and tour buses 9 months of the year. But Phil's response surprised everyone who knew him as the hard-living rock star. He was thrilled, terrified, but thrilled. He wanted to be a father, wanted to do it right, wanted to be present in a way his own father never had been. Sarah Lynott was born in December 1978, and for a brief window, everything seemed possible. Phil held his daughter with a tenderness that surprised bandmates who only knew his stage persona. He wrote songs about fatherhood, about responsibility, about wanting to build something permanent. Caroline watched the man she loved cradle their baby girl and thought maybe this tiny person they'd created would be the anchor that kept Phil grounded. They married on Valentine's Day, 1980, in a ceremony that newspapers covered with photographs of the happy couple. Phil wore a stylish suit. Caroline was radiant in white lace. Both were young, beautiful, and convinced that love plus commitment equaled permanence. Their second daughter, Kathleen, arrived later that year, completing what looked from the outside like a perfect rock and roll family. But inside their home in Richmond, a different reality was taking shape. Phil's drug use, which Caroline had initially dismissed as typical rock star excess, was changing. Cocaine, which had been occasional, was becoming regular, and then something darker entered the equation: heroin. In the early 1980s, heroin had infiltrated the rock scene with devastating efficiency. It was the drug of the cool kids, the outlaws, the ones who lived on the edge. Phil, always drawn to that edge, stepped right over it. Caroline didn't understand heroin at first. She knew about marijuana from university friends, had seen people drunk her whole life, even understood cocaine as party fuel. But heroin was different. Heroin didn't just alter Phil's mood, it replaced his personality. The warm, present man she'd married would disappear for hours, sometimes days, replaced by someone distant and hollow-eyed. When he was high, he was unreachable. When he was coming down, he was irritable and desperate. The small window when Phil was actually himself kept shrinking. Money became a constant source of anxiety. Phil was earning well. Thin Lizzy was successful. His solo work was getting radio play. Yellow Pearl was being heard by millions as the top of the Pops theme. But money vanished as quickly as it arrived. Caroline would find bank statements showing massive withdrawals with no explanation. Bills went unpaid while Phil spent thousands on studio sessions that produced nothing, on friends who were really dealers, on maintaining the lifestyle his addiction demanded. She tried to talk to him about it. Early conversations were gentle, concern dressed up as questions. Are you okay? Are you taking care of yourself? Can we talk about the money? Phil's responses followed a predictable pattern: deflection, minimization, promises. I'm fine. Everyone in the business does this. I'll cut back after the tour. I promise. Just trust me. The promises multiplied like ghosts, haunting their house with good intentions that never materialized into action. Caroline wanted desperately to believe him. Every person who loves an addict wants to believe them, because the alternative, accepting that the person you love has chosen a substance over you, over your children, over everything, is unbearable. By 1981, Caroline was living in a state of constant vigilance. She'd learned to read the signs, the constricted pupils that meant he was high, the restless agitation that meant he needed to get high, the brief window of normalcy that meant the dose was wearing off. She learned to hide money, to intercept calls from dealers, to make excuses to friends when Phil was too high to attend events. She became fluent in the language of addiction, enabling codependency, rock bottom, though she didn't yet have names for what she was living through. The girls complicated everything. Sarah was old enough to notice when Daddy slept all day, when Daddy's mood swung from euphoria to depression with no apparent cause, when Mommy cried in the bathroom thinking no one could hear. Kathleen was still a baby, mercifully unaware, but Caroline looked at her infant daughter and saw the future, another little girl who'd grow up learning that love meant accepting unacceptable behavior. Caroline tried to be the perfect wife, as if perfection could compete with heroin. She kept the house immaculate. She made sure Phil had home-cooked meals when he was actually home to eat them. She scheduled family time, planned activities with the girls, created photo opportunities of domestic happiness. But heroin doesn't care about effort. Heroin doesn't compete fairly. Heroin just takes and takes and takes until there's nothing left. Infidelity entered the picture, though Caroline couldn't pinpoint exactly when it started. Groupies were part of the rock star territory. She'd known that intellectually, but knowing and experiencing are different things. Lipstick on collars, perfume that wasn't hers. Late-night phone calls Phil took in another room, his voice dropping to an intimate whisper. Women who'd call the house, surprised to hear a wife answer, sometimes apologetic, sometimes defiant. Each discovery carved away another piece of Caroline's sense of self. She'd been raised with traditional values about marriage and commitment. Her generation didn't just give up when things got difficult. But there was difficult, and then there was this: waking up each morning not knowing if your husband was alive or dead, finding drug paraphernalia hidden in children's toys, trying to explain to a 5-year-old why Daddy couldn't come to her birthday party. Gary Moore tried to help. Phil's childhood friend and sometime Thin Lizzy guitarist had watched Phil's descent with increasing horror. He'd pull Caroline aside at the few social events she still attended, asking how she was holding up, whether she needed anything. Gary had staged his own interventions with Phil, all unsuccessful, and he recognized the exhaustion in Caroline's eyes. "You can't save him," Gary told her once, his voice heavy with the weight of personal failure. "I know you want to. God knows I've tried. But Phil has to want to save himself, and right now he doesn't. At some point you have to decide whether you're going down with the ship or getting in the lifeboat with those girls." But Caroline wasn't ready to abandon ship. Not yet. Because between the nightmare moments were glimpses of the man she'd fallen in love with. Phil sober, playing with Sarah, making her giggle with silly voices. Phil at the piano, working on a melody, asking Caroline's opinion and actually listening. Phil holding her at night, whispering apologies, swearing this time would be different. Those moments were oxygen, keeping hope alive in an atmosphere that was slowly suffocating her. The other Thin Lizzy members watched the marriage deteriorate from their own complicated positions. Scott Gorham, the American guitarist who'd helped create the band's signature sound, saw how Phil's home life was bleeding into his professional life. There was this extra layer of stress after Phil got married and had kids, Scott would later reflect. He genuinely wanted to be a good father, a good husband, but the addiction was stronger than his intentions, and Caroline, you could see it breaking her, day by day. Brian Downey, Phil's drummer since the beginning, witnessed conversations where Caroline would call looking for Phil, her voice tight with controlled panic, and the band would have to cover for him. "Phil's sleeping," they'd say. "Phil's in a meeting. Phil's at the studio." Sometimes it was true. Often it wasn't. They were protecting Phil, they told themselves, but they were also enabling his addiction and watching a woman slowly lose her mind, trying to hold together a family that was falling apart. The intervention happened in early 1983. Philomena, Phil's mother, organized it with support from Caroline, band members, and a few close friends. They gathered at Phil's house, armed with love, concern, and carefully rehearsed speeches about consequences and treatment options. Each person spoke in turn, describing how Phil's addiction was affecting them, offering specific examples, expressing both love and firm boundaries. Phil listened, or appeared to listen. His face revealed nothing, a mask of polite attention that gave no indication of whether anything was landing. When the last person finished speaking, Phil stood up. "I appreciate everyone's concern," he said, his voice carefully neutral, "but I think you're all overreacting. I have things under control." Then he walked out of his own intervention and didn't come home for 3 days. When Phil finally returned, he acted as if nothing had happened. No mention of the intervention, no acknowledgement of the tears, the pleas, the desperate attempts to reach him. Caroline realized something heartbreaking in that moment. Phil wasn't in denial about his addiction. He knew. He simply preferred the drugs to the alternative, and no amount of love or intervention could compete with that preference. Thin Lizzy officially disbanded later in 1983 after a farewell tour that felt like watching someone's funeral procession. The band Phil had built, that had been his identity for 14 years, was over. Phil told interviewers it was a creative decision, time to move on to new projects. Everyone close to him knew the truth. Thin Lizzy couldn't function anymore with Phil's addiction calling the shots. Without the structure of Thin Lizzy, Phil tried to build something new with a band called Grand Slam. It should have been a fresh start, a chance to prove he could succeed without the old dynamics. Instead, it became a painful demonstration of how completely addiction had taken over. Rehearsals Phil didn't show up for, gigs that had to be canceled, record labels that expressed interest and then backed away after meeting with Phil. The rock and roll dream that had sustained him was crumbling, and drugs were the only thing filling the void. Caroline watched her husband thrash against the consequences of his choices, blaming managers, labels, bandmates, anyone but himself. She realized something that felt like grief. Phil didn't want to get better. Part of him, maybe most of him, preferred the drugs to reality. And that meant no amount of love from her or the girls would ever be enough. The final breaking point came in 1984 during another overdose, another ambulance, another hospital room where doctors spoke in careful tones about this time versus next time. Caroline sat in the hospital cafeteria drinking terrible coffee when Sarah, now 5 years old, asked a question that shattered what remained of her denial. "Mommy, why does Daddy always sleep on the floor?" The innocence in her daughter's voice, the casual acceptance of dysfunction as normal, the recognition that Sarah was learning that this was what love looked like, that was the moment. Caroline understood with brutal clarity that she had to choose. She could keep trying to save Phil and watch her daughters inherit his trauma, or she could leave, get the girls out and try to build a life where they learned different lessons about love and family. Leaving was simultaneously the hardest and easiest decision Caroline ever made. Hard because it meant accepting failure, admitting that love wasn't enough, walking away from someone who was drowning. Easy because staying meant drowning too, and taking 2 little girls under with her. She packed while Phil was out. She'd stopped asking where he went because the answers were always lies anyway. Clothes for her and the girls, important documents, photographs from better days that she couldn't bear to leave behind. She left most of the furniture, most of the memories, most of the marriage she'd believed would last forever. The letter she left for Phil was short, final, written through tears but with absolute conviction. "I can't watch you die. The girls can't grow up thinking this is what love looks like. You need help I can't give you. I hope someday you choose life. I hope someday you choose yourself. I'm sorry I'm not strong enough to stay, but I'm strong enough to save our daughters." She took the girls to her parents' house. Leslie Crowther, who'd once given Phil his blessing to marry Caroline, held his daughter while she sobbed. "You did everything humanly possible," he told her. "More than anyone had a right to ask. You can't set yourself on fire to keep someone else warm." But Caroline felt like failure personified. She'd made promises in sickness and health for better or worse, and she was breaking them. The rational part of her brain understood that addiction wasn't a normal sickness, that for worse had limits, that protecting her children trumped all other obligations. But guilt doesn't respond to rational arguments. Guilt doesn't respond to rational arguments. Guilt just whispers that maybe if you'd tried harder, loved better, been stronger, the outcome would have been different. Phil's response to the separation was complicated. Publicly, he maintained a facade of control. In interviews, he'd mentioned that he and Caroline were taking a break, but everything was fine. Privately, he spiraled harder than ever, without Caroline as any kind of stabilizing presence, without the girls as motivation to at least attempt sobriety. Phil had nothing left to moderate his drug use. Friends who saw Phil in late 1984 and early 1985 described a man who seemed determined to reach some kind of endpoint, though whether that endpoint was death or surrender to treatment, no one could say. He lost weight his thin frame couldn't afford to lose. His skin took on a grayish tone. His hands shook unless he was high. The magnificent charisma that had defined him was flickering out, replaced by the hollow-eyed desperation common to all addicts in the final stages. But here's what makes Caroline's story so painful. She still loved him. Even after leaving, even after everything, she loved the man Phil had been and grieved for the man he was becoming. Love doesn't just evaporate because someone becomes an addict. It twists into something agonizing. You love them, you hate what they're doing, you hate yourself for still loving them, you grieve for them while they're still alive. Caroline would take the girls to visit sometimes carefully supervised meetings in public places where Phil couldn't be high without it being obvious. She'd watch him try to be a father through the fog of addiction. He'd hold Kathleen, who was too young to understand why Daddy didn't live with them anymore. He'd try to play games with Sarah, but he'd lose focus halfway through, his attention drifting to the next fix he needed. And Caroline would see the awareness in Phil's eyes, the grief, the shame, the recognition that he was losing everything but still couldn't stop the loss. Those visits broke her heart every time, but she kept going because her daughters deserved to know their father, even this diminished version of him. And maybe deep down she kept going because hope dies hard. Maybe this visit would be different. Maybe seeing his daughters would be the thing that finally motivated change. Maybe love would win after all. It didn't. By Christmas 1985, Caroline hadn't seen Phil in months. Communication had dwindled to nothing. She'd heard through mutual friends that he was bad, maybe the worst he'd ever been, but what could she do? She had to protect Sarah and Kathleen. She had to protect herself. Loving Phil Lynott had nearly destroyed her, and she'd fought too hard to rebuild. Then came the call on December 26th. Phil was in the hospital. Salisbury Infirmary. It was serious. She should come if she wanted to say goodbye. Caroline's hands shook as she hung up the phone. Part of her had always known it would end this way. You don't use heroin the way Phil did and expect to grow old, but knowing intellectually and experiencing emotionally are different universes. She went to the hospital on December 28th, bringing Sarah and Kathleen. It was a mercy visit, closure for daughters who barely had clear memories of their father. The man in the hospital bed didn't look like Phil Lynott. Jaundice had yellowed his skin. Edema had bloated his body. Machines kept him breathing, kept his heart beating, kept him technically alive while his organs shut down one by one. Sarah, trying so hard to be brave, held her father's hand and told him about school, about her friends, about nothing and everything. Kathleen, confused and frightened, asked in a whisper why everyone was crying. Caroline stood at the foot of the bed watching the man she'd loved, the man she'd left, the man she'd failed to save, and felt a complicated knot of emotions she couldn't begin to untangle. She wanted to say something profound, something that would make meaning from all this suffering, but what was there to say? I'm sorry felt too much like accepting blame for his choices. I still love you felt both true and meaningless. Goodbye felt inadequate for the end of a marriage, a family, a life that should have had decades left. So Caroline said very little. She stood there, one hand on Kathleen's shoulder, watching Sarah try to connect with her dying father, and she let the machines fill the silence with their mechanical symphony. This was how their story ended, not with dramatic confrontations or passionate reconciliations, but with quiet acceptance of a tragedy that had been unfolding for years. Phil Lynott died on January 4, 1986, at 2:04 a.m. Heart failure, kidney failure, pneumonia, septicemia. The official cause was complications from heroin addiction, but the truth was more complex. Phil died because childhood trauma had gone untreated, because the music industry had enabled his addiction, because heroin had promised relief from pain he didn't have other tools to process. The funeral was massive. Thousands lined Dublin streets. The music community came together to honor one of their own. Politicians gave speeches. Fans wept openly. Phil was eulogized as a legend, an icon, Ireland's greatest rock export. Caroline attended with the girls, surrounded by people who'd enabled Phil's addiction, who'd partied with him, who'd watched him deteriorate, and done nothing effective to help. In the years after Phil's death, Caroline rebuilt her life with the kind of quiet determination that doesn't make headlines. She raised Sarah and Kathleen alone, working to give them stability and normalcy. She dated eventually, remarried, found a version of peace that coexisted with permanent grief. But Phil's ghost lingered, in their daughters' faces, in songs on the radio, in the way people would recognize her name and either offer pity or judgment. The judgment was the hardest part. Some people, usually those who'd never lived with an addict, believed Caroline should have stayed. That a good wife doesn't leave when things get hard. That if she'd just loved him more, tried harder, been stronger, maybe Phil would still be alive.
Caroline rarely responded to such judgments. What could she say? That she'd chosen her daughter's well-being over her husband's addiction. That love isn't enough to cure a disease. That staying would have meant teaching Sarah and Kathleen that this is what they should accept from partners. But others understood. Usually women who'd been through similar situations, who knew the impossible calculus of loving an addict. They'd see Caroline at an event, make eye contact and nod. A recognition between survivors. You did what you had to do. You saved who you could save. You're still here and that matters. Sarah and Kathleen grew up with a famous father they barely knew. They had photographs, recordings, his music playing in shops and on the radio. But they didn't have him at school plays, birthday parties or quiet nights at home. Caroline tried to balance honesty with kindness. Yes, your father was talented and charismatic and loved you, but yes, he was also an addict who couldn't overcome his disease. How do you honor the dead without romanticizing the dysfunction that killed them? Gary Moore, who outlived Phil by 25 years, often spoke about the guilt he carried. But he also said something important in a 1990 interview. Caroline was the only one who really tried to save Phil. The rest of us loved him, but we let him do what he wanted, because confrontation was uncomfortable. Caroline confronted him. She set boundaries. She did the hard things. And when nothing worked, she made the hardest choice, protecting her children. Anyone who judges that decision has never loved an addict. The statue of Phil that Dublin unveiled on Grafton Street in 2005 became a pilgrimage site for fans. Caroline attended the unveiling with her daughters, now grown women trying to reconcile their memories of a largely absent father with the icon frozen in bronze. Standing in front of that statue, Sarah said something that captured the entire tragedy. "I wish I'd known this version of him." That's the reality Caroline lives with. Not that she destroyed Phil Lynott, but that she loved a man whose disease destroyed him, and she had to choose between drowning with him or saving herself and their daughters. She chose survival. And decades later, watching tourists take photos with her late husband's statue, she still sometimes wonders if she made the right choice, even though rationally she knows she did. Here's what the simplified narratives get wrong. Caroline didn't destroy Phil Lynott. Heroin destroyed Phil Lynott. Untreated trauma destroyed Phil Lynott. The enablers who surrounded him destroyed Phil Lynott. Caroline was just a woman who tried desperately to save a drowning man, realized she couldn't, and made the agonizing choice to save her children instead. The real tragedy isn't that Caroline left. The real tragedy is that she had to leave. That addiction forced her into an impossible choice. That loving someone wasn't enough to save them. That her daughters grew up without a father because heroin won the war for his soul. Phil Lynott's musical legacy is secure. The Boys Are Back in Town still plays. Thin Lizzy's influence still echoes through rock music. His bass lines still make people move. But his personal legacy is more complicated. A cautionary tale about untreated pain, uncontrolled addiction, and the casualties that pile up around someone slowly committing suicide. And Caroline. She's the woman who loved him through the worst of it, who left when staying would have destroyed her daughters, who refused to let the myth of Phil Lynott erase the reality of what addiction does to families. She's the one who survived. She's the one who raised two daughters who didn't inherit their father's trauma, who broke the cycle of dysfunction that had claimed Phil. If that's what people want to call a curse, a woman choosing her children's well-being over her husband's addiction, then the problem isn't Caroline. The problem is a culture that expects women to sacrifice themselves on the altar of other people's diseases. This isn't a story about a woman who destroyed a man. It's a story about how addiction destroys everyone it touches. It's about the impossible position of loving someone who's slowly killing themselves. It's about the courage it takes to walk away from someone drowning because they're pulling you under too. Caroline Crowther didn't destroy Thin Lizzy's king. She survived him. And sometimes, survival is the bravest thing you can do. If you're in a relationship with someone struggling with addiction, Caroline's story is a reminder. You're not responsible for saving them. You're responsible for your own well-being, and if you have them, your children's safety. Love doesn't mean martyrdom. Sometimes love means leaving. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop fighting a battle you cannot win, and save yourself instead.